thank you for coming along to this Text in the City event here at the Wheeler Centre. My name's Tony Wilson, and that means today in the lexicon of 12 Angry Men, I'm going to call myself Panellist 2 so that you don't get too much personal identification with me. And Panellist 1 will be introduced in a moment, and I can assure you it won't take long to work out that I am the too good to be true panellist that Henry Fonda would play if they were making a screen adaptation of this Text in the City event. And indeed, just in an unrelated aside, I did make a short film myself in 1996 called 12 Angry Articled Clarks that was a reaction to my misery of being in a law firm back at Minter Ellison back then. And the plot of the film was basically that there were signs up in our office saying, please don't hurt the photocopiers. And so 12 of us went out into a field with garden tools and Braveheart style, charged a photocopier and then smashed it to bits with garden tools to the Carmina Burana. And that was 12 Angry Articled Clarks. I'm surprised none of you have heard of it. Which brings us to panellist number 1, Lorin Clarke. She's a writer and director, has written for stage, television and radio, and she's been the television columnist for The Big Issue. Her play For We Are Young and Free was nominated for the Golden Gibbo at the 2007 Melbourne International Comedy Festival, and she caused a great stir this year with her piece Weeds Are As Important As Trees, which was published in Meanjin, and cut through the culture of the comedy festival and really got quite a lot of coverage. Her name's Lorin Clarke, and as a writer and director, she's going to talk 12 Angry Men with us this afternoon. Hello, Lorin.
Hello. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
I thought I might start with the introduction of the play describes, or at least the first, the description of Reginald Rose's life it mentions that this came out of a jury experience for him. And as writers, I know we are bombarded with the, where do your ideas come from sort of question. Have you ever he clearly had such an experience in those 8 hours locked in the jury room that he created a piece that's being worked on 70 years later by students. Have you ever had something where you've gone, I'm going home right now to write something?
Yeah, I think sometimes you'll be sitting somewhere and you'll think, this is amazing, I can't wait to go and write this down. And then you think, but if I did write it down, it would be overwritten. That person, banging his head against the photocopier or whatever, if you wrote that down, everyone go, psh, don't believe it. But having said that, there are some occasions which really do call for this sort of, that you can see it on the page as you're sitting there. And I once had an experience where I was a witness to an attempted murder. I was walking down Smith Street in Collingwood at about 4 o'clock in the morning with a Slurpee. And I saw this man chasing another man with a glass bottle that he'd smashed in half. And apparently he sprinted around the corner and he was screaming at him and so on. He sprinted around the corner and you could hear blood-curdling screams. And I called the cops and I was called to court. I was actually doing a law degree at the time, and so I thought, I'll know all about court. I'm basically pretty much a lawyer. I was in first year uni. And I turned up and I was petrified because all of the stuff this play sort of touches on that. Everything, you really feel so devastated for the person whose destiny is a little bit in your hands. And if you're a witness to something like that, and they're saying things like, and do you remember, and where were you standing, and did he look at him like this, and did he say that, and who said it when, and so on, and you find your hands sweating, and you're looking at this man, and you're pretty sure that it happened that way, but memory is a pretty slippery thing, and he's got a wife and a kid, and the kid's really young, and the wife's sobbing, and you're just thinking, wow, there isn't training for this. I don't really know how I'm supposed to go, where this is supposed to go. And eventually, actually, the case, I didn't need to give evidence. I needed to say some preliminary things, but it didn't get that far. They sort of agreed on the facts, and so I was spared the horrible, because I was one of the main witnesses. I was spared the next step, but it really did reveal to me how coming across the system in that way as just an ordinary person can be so intimidating, but at the same time remarkable, and sort of you think, well, it's a pretty powerful system that it works that way, that so many cases get determined by 12 angry or otherwise people. So anyway, but I remember going away from that thinking that was fodder for some writing. And sometimes you need to sit back for a while and write about it once it's not so raw, because you need a bit of objectivity when you're writing, I think.
With 12 Angry Men, the reason we have this series at the Wheeler Centre is that sometimes in studying texts, you can sort of lose insight into why they've become great works, and in some respects, this is about us as lay people and people who aren't studying the text, celebrating the work. What do you think there is to celebrate in this piece?
Well, this is one of those pieces that is very... If you understand when it was written, you can say it's very much of its time. However, it stands the test of time, which is actually quite a good description of good writing. So that at the time it was written in the 50s in America, and that's very apparent in the way it's written. And it was written when McCarthyism was, the Reds were under the beds and everyone was terrified of, it was the Cold War, and so there was this sort of tension in the air, which I think the playwright is addressing, and he's suggesting that it shouldn't become mob mentality. We shouldn't just turn on when we all have fears and prejudices. We shouldn't ignore the fact that they're fears and prejudices and go with them over the facts. And so I think that was sort of the lesson at the time. But now looking at it, there are elements of it that seem quite dated, so that there's a hero, there's a sort of character in there who throughout the entire thing maintains this moral dignity, juror number 8, and we think, as soon as he starts breaking down the other jury members, we think, he looks like he's a good bloke.
And there's a sense of inevitability about it. I guess if this was being written now, this is just my observation, but I thought that, first of all, that too good to be trueness is very apparent and not very contemporary, and also that the fact that he will triumph here, that each of his pieces of reasoning is a further piece of the jigsaw in terms of unlocking that original misguided jumping to conclusions from the rest of the other 11. There is a sense that he will get there in the end. So I wonder whether if it was being written now, that would be made as clear. I suspect it would be complicated if it were written today, so that there were. Because we've learned as audiences, we've learned not to trust, which is what this, ironically, what this play is really saying is have doubt, be aware of the fact that things aren't always what they seem. Truth and memory are not always the kind of the hard tools of everyone in the play keeps, not everyone, but a lot of the jurors in the play keep saying, come on, it's about the facts. Yeah. And I think now we're much more aware as audience members that facts are a little
more ambiguous and dubious than we might.
And Dick Wolf has had 1,500 episodes or 5,500 episodes to hammer us with that idea that the initial preconception isn't what you trust. It will unfold differently. And so something like this that is written in the first 10 years of television has that whole slate in front of it, really. And it's interesting that it was written for television as well.
I think, you know what they call that? That's called, well, not that, but there's the effect of television on law in that sense has been given a name. It's called the Csi Effect. And what that means is that they've found, there've been all these studies done in America, of course, into, although I think there have been some done here as well, into the effect of television on jurors. And so there are, if you Google CSI Effect, I'm sure you can find this, but there are all these juries who go in to make their decisions, and they've looked at the whole case, and you're supposed to, in a jury, you're supposed to look only at the facts as presented to you in the case, and they've gone and they've looked at the case, and they've found, nope, he's guilty, he's obviously guilty, or he's not guilty, or whatever, and they've become more and more strict as television has, as shows like CSI have been on television, because they expect all sorts of evidence to be brought before them, because in CSI you get to see absolutely everything. You know, there's DNA evidence that just comes out of the blue and helps everybody understand instantly what happens. And because the juries are now going to cases and they're saying, oh, there's a bit of doubt there, they come down really hard on one side or the other, and that's now called the CSI effect. So it's actually having an effect back on the legal system.
Well, the thing that I loved about this, and I'd love you to chuck in the stuff that you really enjoyed as well, but I reckon it's a really skillful piece of plotting. Like, plot's really difficult, and the rate of exposition in 12 Angry Men is really good. That you get more and more of a picture of this crime scene that starts blank because we don't see. You know, just basically you learn, he's young, is he? You know, and so just it drops at about every 2 or 3 pages. You're getting something different. There isn't someone who conveniently just kind of reads out what the crime was. Each time Juror 8 or later on a few of the other jurors are contributing as well, we're learning a little bit more about how this was presented to the court. And so I reckon it's got really good pace, really good expository pace, pretty good structure in the sense of climaxes, like that Act 1 climax has got a fair bit of power to it. Even if it's a bit hokey now, you know, I could kill you. Oh, that's a bit convenient, isn't it? You know, like, but at the same time, you know, it's got a bit of a 50s American TV about it, but it's got a proper climax to it, that act.
One of the things I really like about it is that a lot of the work is not being done by the writer. A lot of the work is being done by you, the audience, so you actually have to picture the defendant yourself. Although in the film I noticed they show the defendant. But you have to picture the defendant, you don't know anybody's name, so you have to imagine, you do a bit of the building around, behind the writing, and you actually don't get to see the case. You're really seeing the reportage of the case. You're seeing the case retold. So you're the jury, really, you're a sort of secondary jury. And you're also judging, of course, all of the characters. And I think that's pretty clever. That setup is pretty clever.
Yeah.
That is interesting. And I think it's a really interesting... There are some really interesting facts, ideas in there about the legal system, you know. There's that old Churchill quote about democracy, which is that democracy is the worst, this is the worst paraphrasing ever, but the worst system of government except for all the other ones. And that the fragility of the Anglo-American legal system is is demonstrated so clearly in this, that we do put a lot of trust in 12 people getting it right.
Yeah.
And judges, if you ever hear any judges speak about juries, they often say juries are pretty much 9 times out of 10 right. They're accurate, they're sensible, they ask the right questions.
Yeah. They don't have a baseball game to go to.
They don't have a baseball
In some ways, he comes across as the most lamentable character in it, because there's something redeemable about Juror 3 with when you think he is battling this demon, and so there's a personal explanation for his bad behaviour.
Yeah.
Juror 10 is harder to justify, perhaps, with his outrages, but Juror 7 is, you could argue, he's up there with Juror 10 in the sense that apathy in the face of democracy, or apathy in face of this responsibility, not caring, not being able to dedicate the time to this kid's life, that level of lack of care is at least demonstrates the same sort of either hatred or antipathy towards difference, because clearly it's only because this person doesn't mean anything to him. And yeah, so this sort of jokester baseball guy, I find him my least, even though I'm a sport head myself, I find him the least likeable juror.
Well,
do you have a most hated juror in there?
Most hated juror? I don't know that I do. I don't like juror number 3, it must be said, but I'm not supposed to. But I think that's another clever thing about the writing, that when you're watching something, a play or a film or a TV thing, and it is getting across a perspective, so that there is obviously, the writer obviously has a perspective, and it's a liberal, individualist sort of American perspective. And that's coming through. It's very difficult when you're writing something like that to also to not sound like you're making that point. So to not sound like a lectury, table thumping person saying you must all go and do exactly what I'm, like, what would it be here? It would be you must all take responsibility for your citizenship as individuals in order for society to work. That's really what he's saying. That's really what this play is about. So on the one hand, you've got that perspective that as a writer you're trying to get across, but what he does is he has all of these different perspectives, and it's like he's anticipating you and me and our perspectives. So it's like he's including up to the point where there are people going, oh, come on, we've been over this. And it's just when the audience is thinking, oh, come on, we've been over this. So he sort of gets, and I like that. I like the fact that he's got someone who just doesn't really care, doesn't want to be there, because there's going to be one. There's going to be 1 in 12 at least. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's a really good thing about his writing, is that all of those characters, even though we don't get to know necessarily their backstories, we know about what it is that motivates them, and we can see that pretty clearly by the end of the play.
The other thing that I think's great about this, and this again comes from is that the reason this has stood the test of time, even more so than the writing or the story, is that it's just a killer idea. Like that idea of writing in an area where very few people see. And I know a lot of people do jury duty, but not many people do jury duty where a life's in the balance, or on a big case like this. And so he's obviously thought, I think he was on a manslaughter jury himself, he's obviously thought, this is just interesting, and not many people see it, and authors are always asking, what if this happened, what if that happened? So clearly he's had his own experience in there and said, it's just, I can provide an insight into a room. And I think when Sidney Lumet made the film, he had a technique where he made the room become smaller and smaller over the course of the film. So it's whether he actually physically made the set smaller or used angles or whatever to give that feeling of confinement. But just to grab that area of life as a writer and make it your own. And now whenever a courtroom jury drama is discussed, I mean, this is the one, isn't it? Now, he thought first to do the jury, and he deserves everything as a result of just staking out that territory.
Yeah, it's a beautiful device because when, as every writer knows, characters need conflict and there needs to be a bit of an obstacle at some point. And quite often the obstacle is actually just time. You know, they've got a deadline. They've got to do something by the end of Thursday. Could be something as boring as that. It's usually not. It's usually there's a wedding or something's happening, and time is your constraint, or space is your constraint. And in this case, it's bloody hot. They're all wanting to be somewhere. So there are all sorts of constraints which pressurise, make it a bit of a pressure cooker environment, as opposed to we've got all day. This doesn't really matter. He's got so many things. We're literally locked in a room. We don't have a million years, and a dude's going to die if we decide one way, and if we decide the other way, then we might have let someone who killed someone go free. So that is quite a beautiful scenario. I was thinking this morning about what sort of, if there are some contemporary examples of it, and I asked a few people what they thought on Twitter, and they said, one of them said Lost is a good example of that. And there are a few other examples. Mine was The Breakfast Club, but a little bit of an old reference.
I know what you mean.
That's sort of stuck in the same place. We've got to sort this out, and we've got to pair it back to... We've got to really figure out what's really going on here.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a mystery as well. That's an exciting element of the play, I think.
Yeah. Is anyone else going to chuck up it's not a bad question. Is anyone thinking of a contemporary example of that confined space? It's all going to be sorted out in an hour type of scenario that's being dealt with here? Such a small group, I thought I'd do some interactive work early. But no, that's all right. I'll continue on. I guess it's one thing that does perhaps date it a little bit, and this I get, not that it's a negative of the play, but it is so about the crime. Even though there is the personalities of the jurors and their reactions to the crime, and a little bit about juror number 3's personal life. But if this was being written now, I can't help but imagine it might also be a time constraint that this was being written for a 55-minute television drama. But it's amazing how it's straight down to business. We're going to talk about the facts of the case, and now I'm going to prove to you this little bit, And so many of the characters are that you only learn little bits about them. Like you learn juror number 11 has an accent and came from Europe, and juror number 5's also wrong side of the tracks type guy, and juror number 12's into advertising, I think. And juror number 2, is it... you start to lose momentum when you get to the lesser jurors, like juror number 6 and maybe juror number...
even juror
2 you don't
1.
know much about. The foreman you don't know much about. So it's interesting just how little he cared about developing that external life. And you were saying, if this was being made nowadays, juror number 8 wouldn't be clean-cut, lovely, shaved Henry Fonda. It would be...
McNulty or something.
Yeah, from The Wire. That sort of... he's come through a marriage breakup. But he's...
But I think he's deliberately avoiding that, and I think he's doing that because... we are entitled to read into things like the fact that that one of the jurors has an accent, and it seems to be, and it says in the script actually that it's a German accent.
Yeah.
And this is post World War II, and here's a man who's from Germany, and this is, what are we supposed to...
And he knows something about oppression or prejudice. I think he says something I know something about. And you assume that he's a watchmaker. He's probably Jewish.
Yeah. So, and he's facing prejudice within the room as well. But that's an interesting thing, because that makes you think, ooh, I'm making presumptions about that man because he has a German accent, which again makes you ask those Socratic questions about yourself, like, hang on, does that matter? Am I inferring something that's actually got to do more with my prejudice, or is it to do with an actual... Is that a fact that's going to help me understand better what the text is doing? So your response to the text is there's a similar relationship there between you and the text and the jury and the facts of the case. So I think that's kind of deliberate, but in fact I think it's very deliberate, because he doesn't give the characters names, he gives them numbers, and so we're not supposed to associate it with personal drama. It's supposed to really
bigger questions of American life.
That's right, and of the legal system. And in fact, there are a couple of sort of, like, there's a bit of symbolism in there. There's the room's really hot. One of them sort of fake stabs the other one in the chest. Yeah. Stuff like that, where you can see that he's making a few sort of big points as opposed to little personal drama points. And as a result, it's a little bit...
He doesn't want to give the victim African-American status or Puerto Rican, or it's there for the audience to make that any type of outsider element in American life.
That's right.
And I guess it would change it nowadays. You can't imagine it being... It certainly doesn't happen often that they wouldn't make that explicit.
No, and I think that's a deliberate decision. And I think if you did the play today, you could do a couple of things to it, and you could make it... Because if you're reading or watching it now, then it represents all the things we've been talking about, and sort of out of historical context, that's interesting enough, because we live in the Anglo-American legal system, and so, hey, this happens every day. So that's interesting on its own. But if you were to direct it and for starters, there'd be some women on the jury, and there'd be you could really project whatever ideas you wanted into the script to reflect what's happening in Australian society today. You could have an asylum seeker in there. The defendant could be an asylum seeker. You could have a transgender. Things that the fact that he's left that other person, either Puerto Rican, African American, whoever it might be, left that sort of blank means, and not brought in too much sort of personal baggage for each character, means we can project as readers, but also as a director, you could
load it up.
You could load that right up, Yeah.
In terms of the crime itself, I guess, just nitpicking again, really, but it's amazing how convenient, I guess. I think we're taught in law school. I did a law degree as well. I practiced for 1 year longer than you, which is 1 year. But I have some memory of facts are presented and positions are argued by the counsel, and then directions are made by a judge, and this really turns into a lawyer behaving in the jury room, doing the job of the defence lawyer. And you could argue that maybe that's actually what happens in jury rooms. I'm sort of not... My understanding is that that's not what's meant to happen in jury rooms. Juries are meant to be deciding facts, what occurred, and that the different interpretations are put to them by the lawyers. And it's not really for them to go, but what about if she wasn't wearing glasses and there were pinch marks on her nose, I think, that suggested glasses. So there was the fact of, it wasn't an arguable fact in the case, pinch marks or whatever. So it's got that sort of sense of Hollywood, I guess. How did you find the actual story? Did it kind of work for you?
Well, on a realistic level there, I had the same questions, because I have a little book at home which is called the Jurors Handbook. I work sometimes at the Law Foundation, Victoria Law Foundation, and they produce this Jurors Handbook. So I have it sitting at home. I looked at it and it says, it is not your job as a juror. It's for jurors when you go in and you sit on a jury. And it says it's not your job to become an investigator. Please don't visit the scene of the crime. It actually says this in the instructions. Please don't. So obviously people have done it. They've gone, well, wasn't quite happy with that, and they've gone and done their own.
Paced out. How far would he have had to walk? You're
actually not supposed to do that, as you say. You're supposed to sort of, that's how the adversarial system works. It's two or however many sides, however many parties it is, representing their sides as best they can, as opposed to an inquisitorial system, which is in countries like France, for instance, where the judge actually and the court go and they sort of decide, they investigate it, and the adversarial system is about these sides. So one thing, the different sides. So one thing that is demonstrated that is true in the play is that sometimes if the lawyer isn't necessarily quite as thorough on one side as the lawyer on the other side is, then you're going to get a bit of a lopsided version of, the system isn't perfect in that way. So I think in terms of how all of that played out as story, there were a couple of points there which were a bit stretched. And I guess because of the nature of the play and how it's sort of a big structural, symbolic play that makes that point, that bigger point, you can kind of forgive that a little bit, especially because of like what you say, it's pacey. Yeah. It's not, you're reading it and then it's all happened. But I followed it. I still found myself going, interesting point about the glasses.
And it would have been quite noisy with that train. That should have been, right. Those. So I guess there's 5 or 6 points that that he's in the pace of the play. He's going to convert X number of jurors with each of his points. It's interesting. One of the really great dramatic moments in the play is I won't waste our time. I need another not guilty right now. He's hardly done any of his investigatory work at that point. And that I imagine, you can see there's a fair bit of play left to read. You imagine that they get through this hurdle, but still it's a nice device early on in the play to say this kid will die if one person hasn't gone with juror 8 already.
Yeah.
And of course, and he does the right thing and doesn't make it the obvious one either. You think it's going to be juror 5 and it's not.